All right. So my first duty is to welcome everyone today, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and share this conversation with us. Although I have to say, although we didn't think of it when we planned to have the event on 20 January, that given what's happening in Washington today, it may actually be a, a bit of like group therapy for those of us to get together and sort of rebuild our confidence in climate action and doing something about the climate crisis. Um, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Richard Kinley. I am the president of the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. Um, which is we like to call it a think and do tank. Um, and we have in the last um, few months been organizing these open consultations, a bit different from the usual panel discussions. We basically want to bring together groups of experts and individuals who are interested in particular topics to develop ideas and perhaps options for how global governance and sustainability could be advanced. Our session today is going to be recorded and it will be available on FOG's Facebook and YouTube channels. If you want to watch it again and again and again or send it to your friends. The if I'm very hopeful that we'll have a really good discussion, and then I would like to take the ideas and compile them into a little discussion paper or options paper that would help to then take the debate forward as we try to come to grips with this challenge we have now of enhancing action. Um, just by way of background, there's a diverse mixture of people in and on the call today. A number of whom I don't really know all that well, and I think many of you will be meeting for the first time, but that's good. It's people from the climate process, it's a number of academics and thinkers who've written widely on climate policy, some implementers, I hope, because we're talking about implementation today, and a number of people who are in the FOGS network who are what I might call multilateralists at heart, or UN people who are very interested in how global governance could be improved. So welcome, everybody. I'm really glad you're here with us. The hope with these open consultations is that we generate a conversation, really, a free flow of ideas. And I really also want to encourage reactions to what you hear, what works, what doesn't resonate with you, so that we have a better sense of what may be interesting things to take and work on and further. We don't have any presentations or a speakers list. I want to hear from as many of you as possible. I will sort of say a few remarks at the beginning to kick things off, maybe irritate you or provoke you, stir things up a bit, and then we can get into a discussion. And I would sort of kick off by saying that some of you have heard this from me before. I feel quite frustrated with what I see as all too often a misunderstanding or a mischaracterization of what I like to call climate multilateralism. All too often, there seems to be an expectation, too much hype, or a sense that the international, the multilateral domain is going to somehow deliver miracles. These what I call save the world moments, and this is particularly true around COPs or summits. And in fact, I've come to actually think that this kind of characterization is actually an illusion, if not a distraction from what really is important. I think we need to acknowledge at the beginning that climate multilateralism can deliver things, and it has delivered 3 significant global treaties. And these agreements include important principles and goals, some commitments, processes, and institutions that are really the architecture for the international climate world. And at the same time, this multilateralism is also has important PR dynamics or awareness raising. And this was extremely important for uh, in numerous decades of the climate negotiations when we were struggling to keep the agenda on the table. And it may actually now become extremely important again. But what multilateralism doesn't do very well, if at all, is deliver implementation. This is completely in the hands of governments and to a certain extent, business. And they're not doing a very good job of this, I would argue. So I come back to my sort of conception of multilateralism, and here I'm then also interested in people who are not climate multilateralists, but from other domains, because I see multilateralism as about helping governments advance their interests, protect their interests, do things better domestically that they want to do, and not so much as an end in itself, but rather a means by which governments can be more ambitious to meet their interests domestically, but also internationally. What the world needs now, in my view, is not more soft COP decisions, but more action from governments with the tools that they have at their disposal, whether policies, laws, regulations, all of these well-known devices to reduce emissions, to strengthen adaptation, and as regards developing countries, to generate support. And we sort of are having this conversation at a moment of great concern with in key countries, we're seeing what I call reactionary backsliding on climate policy. Despite the fact that 2024 was the hottest year on record, that global emissions are still rising, despite that we seem to have hit the 1.5 degree temperature change threshold, and despite this litany of climate disasters that seems to grow with each month. So the question now, coming to the point of our conversation today, is climate multilateralism as we know it okay? I mean, is the current systems, are they doing as much, doing what can be expected? Which I tend not to think so, but I'm interested in hearing from you. Or are there unexploited opportunities by which governments could more effectively act with international support and collaboration to do more to address the climate crisis? And in this way, to move forward the agenda, to change the economic reality, which I think is at the foundation of what we're talking about here, so that there becomes a new norm. And so now I would like to sort of hear your views on these general questions, but more importantly, on what you think would be promising options for new forms of international cooperation or collaboration, whether it's more universal agreements, which seem rather unlikely in the current context, or at the regional level, sectoral approaches, bilateral agreements. And if there are these interesting options, and here basically we're not looking for one option, but are there multiple options which we could then look at in a bit more detail? What would be characteristics of success? Are we talking voluntary or some form of compliance system with them? Governments only, business government collaboration, how to deal with the big question of competitiveness. So this sort of is the array of things I'd be very interested in hearing from you on this morning. And we'll sort of take that as my moment to be quiet and shift the focus to you. and invite you to then to share your views on these questions. We'll use the traditional raise hand function, which I will try to keep an eye on, but apologies if I get overwhelmed by the number of participants, but we'll figure it all out. And given that a number of us are sort of meeting for the first time today, I would ask everybody to please introduce themselves before they make their comments. So as I said, we have no other speakers. I was it. So I'm now very keen to hear basically your reaction to the points that I may have made, or your ideas about what could be promising points of departure for future global collaboration. All right, we have one volunteer to go first. Anitra, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I'm Anitra Thorhog, and I'm the co-president of the Club of Rome Association for the United States. And second of all, I'm a full member for decades of the International Club of Rome. I'm a marine scientist who has for 50 years worked on restoring under the water habitat when nobody thought about doing that, and there wasn't anything on anyone's radar, either industry or private sector. So I have worked with at least 10 of the multilateral institutions, including the regional ones, because I had the Club of Rome associations in the Western Hemisphere and have a book about the future of the Western Hemisphere, which very much is important to have the ecosystems intact or regenerated. So you could call me a regenerative marine scientist. And I have over and over looked at the entire globe. I work in the tropics mostly, and I have looked at what we need, which I think is going to be a Marshall Plan. By that, I mean the plan that was put in place after World War II to bring back countries that did not have sufficient capital to bring back their basic productivity institutes and governments. And the Marshall Plan for bringing back the ecosystems, of which FAO says 85% of the global forests have been deleted, decimated, and which the underwater people say 70% of the coastal marine habitats have been deleted. Now, both of these things sequester, which is a fancy word from saying scrub from the atmosphere and water the carbon and stick them into the sediment or soil. And therefore, they immediately go to a solution for lessening the carbon dioxide in the air. Whatever made mankind think that they could decimate all the forests and still have sufficient air to breathe, which is absolutely a human necessity, is beyond me. But it says in the Bible that people have dominion over the earth, which is completely wrong. So we in the Club of Rome in general find it very frightening that what I call the big oil boys in the last IPCC meeting in the Middle East or Eastern Asia have taken over and see things through their own lens rather than through the lens of what is necessary globally. So what is my solution? My solution is to immediately begin in the tropics, because the tropics the tropics sequesters much more rapidly than the temperate zone and about 10 times more rapidly than the Arctic. Immediately start for the next 10 years sequestering tropical forests and mangroves and seagrasses and coral reefs in the subtidal. And we should be looking at about 100,000 acres of forests in the primary places, such as Brazil, Cameroons, Southeast Asia. And we should be looking at bringing back the coastal areas in the small island states and in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia. This would cost about $1 trillion. But $1 trillion has to be put next to the fact that they're now spending on this inaugural tonight $100 million. And they had contributions to the political campaigns of several hundred millions of dollars, which is about $250 billion. And these monies are being spent frivolously on political difficulties, to political disagreements. This solution that I have would be planting with village people, so there's equity component, particularly village women, so there's a gender component, and it has to be spread around the world. So that's
Right,
my suggestion.
Thank you, Anita. I think so. First one is an idea for a major reforestation / sequestration initiative, and we could maybe have some comments later about where this might belong and how it might be advanced. But now I turn to others who might like to jump in. Please, no modesty. Joanna, great. Good to see you, Joanna.
Good to see you, Richard. For those of you who don't know me, I used to work with Richard, which was highlight of my career, of course. I'm now at Cambridge University. So you won't be surprised to hear, Richard, that I disagree with pretty much, I agree, sorry, that was a strange thing to say. I agree with almost everything you say. So that's a good start. I did have a few kind of big picture remarks, if I may. I think you're absolutely right that there has been a mischaracterization about what the climate treaties and the regime can actually achieve. I get a bit fed up with seeing these statements whereby, oh, the UNFCCC must do this or must do that. And I try and make the point that the UNFCCC is not actually an actor as an of itself. It's a legal treaty. And the Secretariat itself, obviously, its mandate is very much constrained in terms of what it can do. So I think we all need to keep that in mind. And I think when we make proposals, and I really appreciated the one just now on afforestation, we need to think, well, who would actually do this? And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. You mentioned helping governments to do more. I think that's absolutely right. I think in the current context, what we need to do, and this is a bit of a nuance to what you said, is to actually boost progressive forces within government. So I think there's a limit to what one can impose or encourage actually with national governments who guard their sovereignty very closely. But we have to look to the progressive forces. And I think there are progressive forces everywhere, including in those countries that might seem like a bit of a dead loss at the moment. And I think there was a lot going on with this pre-Paris. And I think maybe there needs to be a bit of a resumption of that alliance building of progressive forces. Messaging, I think, is very important, because I am worried that at the moment there's so much doom and gloom around. I kind of worry that we're all slightly descending into despair. And I think that's not healthy. And I think it's not helpful. And I would just point out a couple of things, which is that, you know, the latest Secretariat Synthesis report shows that pretty much all the 2020 targets of Annex 1 countries were actually met they were all met. We all know the Kyoto Protocol targets were all met, and Climate Action Tracker does show over time that the projected temperature rise has actually gone down with the various commitments and pledges definitely since before Copenhagen. And also, if we take all pledges and targets into account, we're looking at about 2.1 degrees C temperature rise. I think there's possibly been a strategic error, and I know this isn't fashionable, in really pivoting towards 1.5. I think we sometimes forget that the actual goal in the Paris Agreement was actually well below 2. And now everybody's talking about 1.5, and I could completely see why. But I think we do have to remember it was originally well below 2, and that's what countries thought was feasible at the time. Finally, and I'm sorry to maybe talk a bit too much, I think you're absolutely right that we don't need any more universal agreements. And I think partly for the reasons that Anita was talking about, I think they're not feasible. But what I think we do need are agreements among the ambitious, among champions, among the vanguard. And I know these things have been talked about for a long time. What I would like to see is an element of legal bindingness to these agreements that might be reached. I think there's been a lot of voluntary clubs. I'm not too sure how much they've achieved. Maybe others can speak to that. But I mean, I know this is a bit radical, but I wonder whether we couldn't have partial agreements among a certain group of countries under the UNFCCC. And I've written about that recently. So those are my big picture thoughts for now. And I hope they'll help to provoke even more discussion than your excellent introduction, Richard. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. That's really good food for thought. It leads me to actually put a couple of people on the spot, and I hope they don't mind. One is Nicholas Höhne, who many of you know is one of the trackers of national NDCs and climate action. And I wanted to see, based on what Joanna was saying, if he had, or in your analysis, Nicholas, if there were in the national policy domains any candidates which jump out at you as topics or subjects which would really benefit from these kinds of perhaps group associations to champions, coalitions of the willing, for lack of a better term. So are there some candidates for that? And after you, Nicholas, I see other hands are popping up. We'll come to those. I also wanted to ask Simon Sharp, if you don't mind, Simon. Joanna mentioned these type of mini group agreements, sectoral agreements or whatever. I know you've written a lot on this. I'd really be interested in sort of how you would react to these questions of legal bindingness, what would be good candidates, how broad, this type of thing. And then I'll come to Sebastian and to Jen and whoever else comes next. So, Nicholas, sorry to put you on the spot, but I've been a big fan of yours for a long time. I know you can handle it.
Thanks. Same here. Actually, I'm Nicholas Höhne. I'm with New Climate Institute in Cologne in Germany. I also used to work with Richard and many others who are in this room. It's really nice to see you all. It's really great. First, I think everybody in this room probably is a big fan of the multilateral process. That's why we're here. And I think what Joe said, we need to advertise for it and the achievements that it has. No, global greenhouse gas emissions are still going up, but our outlook has significantly improved. No, we are doing the climate action tracker and also the UNEP emissions gap report, and it always looks at the future. So our outlook for what would happen in the future. And 20 years ago, we said we would go to 4 to 5 degrees by the end of the century. Now we are pretty sure it will be in the order of 3, but no, 4 and 5 is out, definitely. And in the optimistic case, what Joe has said already, if all countries do their net zero targets, which they have promised under the Paris Agreement, is more in the order of 2 degrees. So that's significantly better than before. And I think that's super important to note that our outlook is much, much better. And that is due to this multilateral process. The other one point that I would have is some people say, hey, why do we need the COP at all? I would say, well, we do need it, but maybe a bit downsized. No, focus on taking annually stock, yes, but that's it. Not actually much more new agreements are not necessary. I think what's really important now is just to take stock each year, have this PR moment, say, okay, here we are not there yet. What has worked, what has not. That would, I think, be, from my point of view, the best role of the COP process. And then, indeed, I had on my list as well the smaller groups. For me, the biggest success in the past was the support for renewables, which now allows us actually to have this more positive outlook of the future. And the renewables were supported by a small group, but a critical mass of countries, not really coordinated. They didn't have a treaty to do this, but they simply did it. Yeah? So in Europe, they supported renewables significantly. Well, it started in the US, but later in Europe, really. And then the renewables are now so cheap that they're used everywhere, even by those that don't want it. Yeah, and this is a small group who invested in significantly. And that kind of model, I think, would be super useful for others. And for me, for example, green steel could be one where that could work. Yeah, so you create a market of critical mass where you heavily support green steel or even mandate it. And then all of a sudden, the technology becomes so cheap that everybody on the whole earth is using it. That's one way of doing it. Or for efficient appliances, is already working in the EU. So the EU has efficiency standards. Anybody on the global market who wants to ship something to the EU has to comply with them. And that means all appliances are efficient. And another club that I think is interesting is the club of fossil fuel, or countries that are dependent on fossil fuel imports. I think those countries could be really interesting to look at. And all of these little clubs, I think, are in addition to the UNFCCC. It's not as a replacement. I think it's an addition. And one last point I always have hopes of litigation, but I'm not the expert. There's other experts here in the room, I think, that know better than me, but I always hope, what can we do? How can we set up the multilateral process so that litigation does really work? I think that will be a super interesting thing to think about. Thanks. Looking forward.
I know we have some people on the call who are well positioned to comment on that, so maybe they will jump in. Sebastian, oh no, sorry, I had put the spotlight on Simon before Sebastian. Simon, if you wouldn't mind, these clubs, voluntary, compulsory, big, small.
Sure, thanks, Richard. And at the same time as you were putting me on the spot, I was trying to figure out how to raise a hand anyway, and I'm failing to do so. So, look, thanks for provoking the discussion, and I've heard a lot to agree with already. I'm agreeing with you and Joe in what you've said about multilateralism, in the sense that what it has done so far on climate change is what it is good for generally, which is broad-based consensus on goals and principles. If you think about other fields of diplomacy, that's where maximum universal participation multilateralism tends to lead. If you're talking about peace or nuclear non-proliferation or trade, then, when you have maximum breadth, then you have minimum depth, which is not to say that it's not valuable. It is valuable. It sets the scene for a lot of other things, but you shouldn't expect it to get real depth, as you were saying, driving implementation. For that, you need diplomacy among smaller groups. And so I think for that, on climate change, we need smaller groups, and that means plurilateral. Plurilateral is where the real focus should be. So by analogy, you can have the nuclear non-proliferation agreement, all countries concerned, sets out direction of travel. But then when you wanted to have the Iran nuclear agreement, you had 6 countries, and they went into a great deal more detail at solving that particular problem. The analogous thing on climate change, on global emissions, is you focus on each of the sectors separately. Each sector, its transition is a problem that is unique to that sector, and it's different from the other sectors. So you're asking candidates and examples. Well, I think Nicholas already referred to steel. It's a great example where a critical mass of countries could shift the global market for steel if they can agree on an approach to aligning trade with the transition. Another one where trade really matters is the forest risk commodities, palm oil and soy, where you've got big producer and consumer countries that would need to agree on the standards for those and the transparency arrangements and support to smallholder farmers who are affected by that transition. Both of those are very different from something like renewable power, where a different group of countries could cooperate on reducing the cost of capital for developing countries, or, for example, from road transport, where you could have countries agreeing on how do you get the right infrastructure along road freight corridors across international borders. Key point is how different each of those are in the nature of the problem to be solved and in the identity of the countries that could come together to solve those problems. So I tend to think it's not always, when you think about participation, it's not just about which are the ambitious leader countries, it's also about which ones have influence. You want groups of the influential that can agree with each other what to do, rather than necessarily coalitions of the willing who are ones that already agree with each other. Final point is, you asked this question about legal bindingness. I think it's a really interesting one. I would say in some senses, yes, we want that because a trade deal is legally binding, and possibly the most powerful agreements we can have on global emissions are ones that link standards to trade in global markets. But I think you get to that at the end. Agreements grow and develop and they get stronger as they go on. That's the end of the process. You don't want to make that the bar for everything at the beginning. There are lots of effective forms of cooperation that don't need to be legally binding at the outset. They just need partners to get together and gradually increase trust and increasingly align their actions over the course of time.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up question? For these cases that you mentioned, do you think that there are international organizations which would be the home for these kinds of clubs, or are they really dependent upon the member countries, and so one or two of those member countries being in the lead, and because I guess where I hesitate is on these groups like the G7 or the G20, where you have rotating secretariats and nothing really ever gets followed up in situations like that. How do you have continuity in these type of arrangements?
Yeah, I think the single most striking thing when you look into all of this is that we don't have the institutions we need to get the job done, to have the right kind of plurilateral cooperation. If you look at steel, for example, yeah, the G20 is not appropriate because Saudi Arabia can veto everything. You do not need Saudi Arabia to be part of the group agreeing how to handle trade and the steel transition. The G7 is no use because China and India aren't in it. The OECD Steel Committee is not ideal because China thinks it's a gang of Western countries against China, and so on. The institution you need for that actually needs to be created, and it won't happen by itself. As you said, you need countries to take the lead in creating the appropriate institutions that then facilitate cooperation between the countries.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Thank you. All right. Sebastian, you've been waiting patiently. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say.
Thanks. Sebastian Overture of the Flemish Free University of Brussels and the University of Eastern Finland, and obviously I've been playing roles in the process for some time. Yeah, so these kind of plurilateral clubs, or whatever you want to call them, I also had on my list. But perhaps to start with, I think we know that we need to enhance climate action, as you said, Richard, but the game at the moment is really, from where I sit, preventing backsliding. And for that, it's decisive to develop and stress a positive agenda rather than coming always. We see that it doesn't move people anymore to say, oh, we are beyond 1.5. Yeah, okay. So what's the positive agenda? But just on that basis, the difficulty with the club approach, as I see it, is just also geopolitics. The research has identified enough sectoral issues that countries and other players could cooperate on, including green steel. But then if you have followed the climate club setup and how that has evolved, you could see all the difficulties that are involved. And I think actually the climate club as it has now been established a little bit apart from the G7, has the potential to work on green steel. But it's difficult in a situation where you have the US and China around watching each other, and they are important players, so you eventually want to have at least one of them in, etc. So it's tricky, and you need to, when you select, not just say, okay, that's a promising area, but you need to look at the geopolitics of it and work on that. That was, I guess, message number one. And the second element that I would want to bring in is, if we are focusing more on implementation, and if that's the purpose, then I think one thing that international institutions can do is support and establish accountability. And again, accountability has been termed in a negative way. So I would rather see international institutions, including Paris and the UNFCCC, to be able to establish an opportunity for actors to claim accountability and to display what they are doing positively, positive agenda, as I said, and get credit for it in the process. And those could be these clubs, those could be individual countries, this could be transnational initiatives that are driven by the private sector, but give them that kind of attention that the COP draws to be able to portray and present something positive and thereby drive the process. Thanks.
Thank you, Sebastian. I really think on that last point that there's a lot of potential there which has been not used, given that so many of the on-the-side initiatives at COP were tended to be transitory. I mean, if they could be made more enduring, then you could see, in conjunction with COPs, these really quite positive events showing where progress is being achieved. So I think there is quite a bit there of potential. Jen Allen.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks for the invitation. This is a great conversation so far. I have to say, my couple little points I keep adding to my list of things I want to say. So I will be brief because there's smarter people than me coming up that will have more interesting things to say, I'm sure. I also share the frustration, I mean, as you know, with the COPs will save everything and this one COP will save the world conversation that seems to happen every year. In part because, I think we need to look at maybe two or three things that seems to happen around that discourse. One is that it's really helpful or I think it's maybe because we see a lack of action that everyone hopes, okay, this COP, we'll see, I get media requests before every COP saying, will we see new pledges? As if that's one, helpful, because it's more important, as you say, to implement the pledge than to make a new one. And two, as if that is the role of what every COP is supposed to be. So there's certainly that. And I think this is also driven because there's active attempts to obscure what COP really is. The mitigation work program is a series of roundtable discussions about different sectors every year with no real outcomes or outputs or anything out, but it lets countries say, well, don't worry, we're talking about mitigation when they're only talking. So I think that there is some obfuscation happening, to use or to riff off of Joanna's work. I think it's also that COP's a circus, and that this is my bugbear. It's just giant, and so many people there don't need to be there. I mean, gosh, heads of state have nothing to say anymore that we haven't heard. They don't need to bring all their handlers. They add about 5% to COP participation for their 1 day or 3-minute speech. And there's been some work with ECBI and others on how we can meaningfully or helpfully slim down COP. So I think looking at that, because it's when you have the biggest event on the UN calendar, it means one, only a few countries can host this monster, and they are not climate vulnerable countries. So adaptation and loss and damage will struggle to feature in any presidency's priorities. And two, it does create this notion of, well, if we have all these people, if we have 70,000 people or 65,000 in Baku or whatever it was, of course they should be getting together to save the world. Otherwise, why are they there? So I think we do need to address the circus a bit and think about that. It's not going to radically change negotiation outcomes, I think, but I think it would help. Just on clubs quickly, I agree with Sebastian. I wrote beside it, if we have sectoral clubs, which I think are actually a really useful idea, all of them are going to need China and all of them are going to need the US. That doesn't mean it's impossible. At the technical level, conversations around specific sectors can be had regardless of geopolitical tensions. But you certainly can't imagine some sort of roundtable on electric vehicles without talking about, well, maybe the tariffs that the EU has put up against Chinese build your dreams cars. I think maybe just one thing I'll quickly say, sorry, or two quick things, is at the UNFCCC, I think maybe what we need to think about doing is reframing the conversation around justice and people. So yes, emissions have gone down from what we thought they were going to pre-Paris. Well, the emissions haven't gone down. The projections for global warming have gone down. That could just be the markets doing its thing because renewables are cheap. That doesn't mean that that's actually making sure that people are involved in this transition or going to have a role. And for me, COP is the one place that we can have something like a loss and damage fund get pushed through, because all countries and climate affected have a stake. And then otherwise, I think we need to do some thinking around leveraging institutions. MDB reform, we need to take that seriously. I mean, 80% of climate finance is increasing the debt burden on countries in the global south, and most of that's coming from multilateral development banks. Thinking about how the GEF is spending its money, having meetings between the G20 and the V20 might be helpful. Looking at the UN's Chief Executives Board and all those UN collaborations between the various agencies on climate change, maybe someone could get the FAO in line a little bit and see if maybe they could be a bit helpful. So I think there's a lot to do with what we have, and I just worry making anything new that we actually don't have time for that, to be honest. But I've spoken so long that Zoom has given up on me and told me to lower my hand, so I'm very sorry.
Jen, maybe you could just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, of course, no one knows. Why would you know me? I'm Jen Allen. I'm at Cardiff University, and I'm a strategic advisor for the Earth Negotiation Bulletin.
Thank you very much. You said one thing, which I'm not going to comment on, but others may want to come in on. You raised the question of financing, multilateral development banks, etc. And I'm wondering if there's this is clearly an area that needs critical attention. How in the next while could this be advanced by those countries who want to? To me, that's I'm really grappling with that. But now I would go to Michael Grout.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and everyone. A really interesting mix of people. So yeah, Michael Grubb, I'm a professor at UCL, and I think my perspective in a sense reflects a bit of a two-stage of career on this. I spent earlier stage very much in the international arena when work at Chatham House, and so very familiar with UNFCCC and those processes. But subsequently, many years working more on implementation, particularly energy, technology, policy systems, transition, etc. And I think the conversation and just my observations of when I still do go to COPs is just how big the difference is between these worlds. And in some ways, maybe it's got wider. So a few remarks from that observation. First, I think it was Roosevelt said all politics is local. And that to be blunt, is the simple answer to how it is that we've made so little apparent global progress, despite all of the top-level warnings, because warnings about 1.5 and thresholds have rather limited traction to governments trying to work out how do you change regulation in a particular sector, where a lot of the action is driven by interests, but also, I think, crucially driven by perceptions and framing of the economics. So, first of all, I think we'll continue to get nowhere as long as it is broadly seen in the international negotiations and framed as a burden-sharing argument. I think we've kind of got a good couple of decades to prove that you just can't solve that global burden-sharing problem through a top-down process. The alternative perspective is very much, it's about a series of sectoral transitions in the context of mitigation, I hasten to add. I think adaptation is a lot tougher in one sense. But the sectoral transitions are broadly around what's the dynamics of change in half a dozen sectors. There's broadly the classic 6 sectors mapped out by the IPCC. Few remarks around that. First, I think it's very clear that transitions are not about some, marginal cost of burden that countries have to take on. They're about processes of investment and returns to investment. So, the alluded Germany spent 100 billion euros or more of consumer money on driving what's become a global revolution. Still arguments in Germany about did it capture enough of the benefits from the solar revolution. Did the international system help? Not really, no. It was kind of almost irrelevant, except that part of the framing of that was around Germany's commitment to meeting its targets along with its domestic political situation. Jen mentioned a couple of things from comments. Jen mentioned framing around justice, which is very desirable, but the continual absence of reference to interests and power of implementation and actors in the sort of the more environmental discussions, I think is again, we'd all like a more just world. So how does it happen, etc. I think the sectoral transitions is also illustrating, I think Nicholas made a reference to electricity is now really cheap, there's no problem there. Well, actually, no. You hear a lot of developing countries saying they're facing a very high cost of capital for investment, and that's partly a problem of how the international financial system is structured, all the perceived risks. Now, that's something international cooperation could help with, but that's not going to be decided in the UNFCCC. And tariffs is another issue. So I think understanding where the real barriers are to transitions and where the opportunities lie, and who can reasonably make investments in accelerating transitions is really where this conversation has to go. Now, architecturally, would it be possible for the UNFCCC to countenance a structure of let's have a series of sub-agreements? We don't need everybody involved in those sub-agreements. There's absolutely nothing to suggest you need every country in the world involved for any of these 6 transitions. But you do need some of the major industrial players, maybe not all of them. And the problems they have to address are kind of often quite boring, geeky ones, like tariff structures and cost of capital risks and maybe guarantee mechanisms. But yeah, I'm just saying there's 2 different worlds, and we're only going to solve this problem if we can work out more constructively the relationship between them. But I'll stop there because I'm also saying too much.
Great, thank you, Michael. Very sobering comments. The next hand I saw was David Champy.
Hello, my name's David Champy. I'm a social scientist and also a psychotherapist in private practice in Massachusetts. I just been listening to some thinking about the connections between businesses and governments. And I think that really establishing greater partnerships with university research teams are really, really an integral part of moving forward and trying to get some more movement on climate issues. one of the partnerships that I think is really important is the consortium of climate solutions, and MIT and Harvard are part of this consortium. So that's just one pathway that I think would be of interest and something worthy of pursuing. I'm trying to keep it rather brief so other people can talk as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I did. Then, well, you mentioned MIT and Harvard. We now go to Oxford. Lavanya.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this fascinating conversation. Like several others in this group, I have also had the privilege of working with Richard back in the day. I guess perhaps because of the composition of the group, I find myself violently agreeing with everything everyone else has said. But I did want to raise a couple of issues in relation to some of the points that have already been raised. One in relation to bindingness of some of these sort of sectoral agreements, and the second in relation to the relationship or the link between litigation and the multilateral negotiations. So in relation to bindingness, I think while there are obvious there's an obvious intuitive appeal to having binding agreements and the political signaling that comes from these binding agreements, I think the transaction costs of getting these binding agreements are going to be far too high for us to be able to pay them, and certainly not within the time frame that's necessary to sort of solve this problem. And I think it will also likely come at the cost of, very important cost of, ambition and stringency, because the more likely it is that you have a binding agreement, the less likely it is that you'll have an ambitious, stringent agreement that's also binding, which is perhaps part of the reason why we met the targets in the Kyoto Protocol. We're meeting the targets for 2020, but it's actually we're not resolving or determinatively solving the problem. So there is a distinction between compliance with legally binding agreements and effectiveness. So I think we should be sort of cautious about and I feel somewhat treacherous saying this, but as a lawyer, but I think we probably need to be cautious about appealing to bindingness for every sort of agreement that we have. What I think instead we could do is actually design these agreements, even if they're not sort of legally binding and subject to sort of state consent procedures, we could still have agreements that have some sort of review mechanism built into them, so that we are actually continually putting the spotlight on what states are actually doing. So if they say they're going to do something in year one, outside COP21 or on the sidelines of COP21 or COP25 or 28 or 29, that next COP, we're actually going to follow up on that and see, did states actually do what they said they were going to do, or have they come back with a new sort of announcement? So follow-up and review mechanisms are something we can build into these agreements, irrespective of whether these are actually binding or not. And there are examples, I think, of agreements which are not binding, which still have review sort of mechanisms built into them. And I think the second sort of point I would like to make in relation to litigation and negotiation is that it's possible to leverage a lot of the very sort of progressive forces in the litigation community and litigation world, leverage them to actually advance the negotiations. So, of course, I agree with many who have said we need to streamline these negotiations. We need to downsize them. We certainly do. We have to start by downsizing this agenda, I think, which has a lot of sort of dead weight items on it, which take up a lot of time but are not going to go anywhere. It's important to make these negotiations more dynamic and fit for purpose. And I think the purpose of these negotiations ultimately has to be to provide some sort of normative direction and pull, so that all these other forces, sort of subnational forces, national forces, regional forces, sectoral forces, progressive forces that Joanna was talking about across all of those, can actually pull in the same direction. So I think what the multilateral regime can do is help with that directional pull. And litigation can really help with that. I think we have now, we've had several progressive judgments at national courts, and more recently in regional courts with the European Court of Human Rights decision in Klima Senioren, and now sort of international sort of courts and tribunals with the ITLOS decision, advisory opinion rather, and the forthcoming Inter-American Court of Human Rights sort of advisory opinion, and of course the ICJ's advisory opinion. Now, off the lot, the ICJ's advisory opinion, is likely to be the most guarded off the lot. But having said that, all of these are likely to, I hope, at least establish with some degree of certainty that states have very strong due diligence obligations which drive us in a particular direction. And the due diligence obligations have to be tied to sort of Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. That is the direction we're going in. So I think we can use the international agreement to actually, and the agreements to, and the multilateral process to actually give us a very strong directional pull, but then look elsewhere for all the rest of the pieces to fall into place. So there's just some thoughts on a couple of issues that were raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lavanya. Next would be Li Shuo.
Thanks very much, Richard, and Happy New Year to all the colleagues. Li Shuo, I work for the Asia Society Policy Institute. We are a Washington, D.C. based organization, and in my career over the last 15 years or so, I've covered the UNFCCC Paris negotiations. My current job, in my current job, I cover quite extensively U.S.-China relationship, in particular in environment and energy and climate change. Let me just start by saying that I agree with some of the previous interventions, in particular, some of the challenges that climate multilateralism faces. In my view, just to kind of complement previous interventions, one of the biggest challenges for climate multilateralism, I think, in the next few years will be industrial and trade-related competitions. And how does the world manage those tensions? Tensions that are happening primarily at a bilateral level, and tensions that do not happen to be effectively managed or addressed by any multilateral fora. I would also just want to highlight one previous intervention which mentioned climate clubs or small groupings. And I think really the question there is how do you, of course, benefit from a smaller set of countries, right? In moving, being able to moving faster, but at the same time, take out the geopolitical flavor out of it. How do you actually balance these two? I think it will be very, very challenging over the next few years. But Richard, I want to come back to the question that you posed at the beginning of this conversation, which is trying to be more solution-oriented or forward-looking. I have to admit I don't have the silver bullet, but let me kind of throw out two questions, just in case that helps our collective thinking. The first question that I want to pose is maybe in seeking solution for multilateralism over the next couple of years, it's worthwhile asking ourselves where exactly we are at this political moment. Where exactly we are in this political cycle. Do we believe the backlashes on multilateralism will be with us for some time and for the foreseeable future? Or do we think the rightward-leaning movement across the world is a relatively short-term phenomenon? It's difficult to reach a decisive answer to this question, but I think that the answer to that question and to play out the different scenarios will actually help us in thinking how do we design the future of multilateralism, and how do we move away from the rather challenging season that we're in now. The second thing that I want to mention is maybe, just maybe, it's worthwhile and it is high season for us to be bold and think out of the box. I know it sounds cliche, but and I say this not only because the climate crisis certainly deserves bold thinking, but if you look around the world, now that I'm based in DC, I feel that we will see in the next month or so a lot of unconventional, out of the box, even outlandish solutions to traditional, conventional, social, economic, geopolitical problems. And a lot of those solutions we may not agree as the climate community. But I'm just wondering whether that actually represents a new way of how the world thinks about some of the global challenges. our community, they actually in some ways benefit from that thinking. Either the political space that thinking creates for us, or if we can even draw some inspiration from that. I just want to kind of throw that out as a second question for us to kind of collectively chew on. Hopefully this is helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. I mean, I think the point is actually well taken. I mean, to a certain extent, having this conversation is actually, it's not radically out of the box, but I mean, it breaks out of this mold that everything has to be along the way it has always been. COP 20, COP 30, COP 40, COP 50. But there are alternative things. And I agree very much that we do need to think about doing things differently. And I really take your point about the importance of these, I was going to say competitiveness, but I think you called it industrial and you had another word.
Industrial and trade related competition.
And trade relation challenges. How big are these and are there ways to manage them, I guess? And obviously, we're into a period where we really can't expect much from, if anything, except probably problems from the US. But I'm wondering if other major actors like China, like the EU, to what extent are they prepared to engage in even out of the box thinking, like you were saying, or in collaboration to try to advance on these issues where they, if they have a perceived common interest. And others may want to come back, comment on that. And I would be very interested to, if other people would like to come in on this question of competitiveness, because it does. I remember in my first climate meetings, this was the rationale for having multilateral agreements, was how to manage competitiveness. And it now seems to be coming back to the fore as a issue of key consideration. We now have a couple more hands. I see Michael would like to come back in. Michael, please.
Well, if I may, the competitive issue has always been partly around, but it's been solved so far in that negative framing by making a lot more progress in sectors that didn't face direct international competition, like electricity in Europe. But I think I really just on that want to draw your attention to, I thought it was a great paper by Michael Mailing called Good Spillover, Bad Spillover, because it's amazing how negatively the word competitiveness is being framed, when actually, of course, in talking about need $1 trillion of investment, you're talking about $1 trillion of revenue to technologies which provide low carbon solutions. So a lot of my business colleagues are really puzzled about the way competitiveness always gets talked about in a negative way, rather than where and how do you build advantage in rising industries? And then crucially, where are the markets and where and how do they get created, and are they stable and reliable enough? And that's where the opportunities side of this whole equation emerges. That was a direct response. I just wanted to add in that I think Shirley's comments are absolutely spot on. We will see radical and disruptive. The problem seems to be that will not be coming from an actor that's trying to solve a global problem. I think that it follows probably the disruption for the next stage is probably going to have to be led from the BRICS. But that will be framed around where and how can they start to build, some elements of competitive advantage in low carbon technologies. And we do see China beginning to talk a bit that way. And the connection with the international system is fairly clear. My question back to this audience is the way some of the conversations gone, and I think Simon's probably too modest to raise it, was curious to see an initiative like that in the breakthrough agenda that then seems to be almost disappeared. I'm just interested, what did people think of the efforts of the breakthrough agenda or similar initiatives sort of on the margins of COP? Do they just regard it as, well, some government tried that at a COP and the process is going to ignore it? Or where do those things go? Do they get traction, and if so, how?
All right, thanks, Michael. I'm not sure if Simon is still here. I know he had another appointment, so if Simon, if you'd like to come back, you'd be most welcome. But I see Dr. Hubert Danso.
Sorry, Richard. We
Yes.
also have Michael Zamet Kutaja who's trying to speak, but he's not able to locate the hand. So if you could,
Okay.
yeah.
Should I come in? Not come in?
Is that Simon?
Yeah.
Yes. Why don't you go ahead, and then I'll follow up with Michael Zamet and the others.
Okay, wonderful. I'll be very, very, very brief. I represent the institutional investment community on the African continent, and also work very broadly with the institutional investment community across the United States through the CFA Asset Owners Council. And I think one of the ways that we, and I have to put my hands up, I'm glad to be here. I came here to learn more about multilateralism more generally, but I have to describe myself much more as a multipolarist, because I believe that we're in much more of a multipolar dynamic going forward. And I feel that a lot of the multilateral thinking seems to be very set in a very rigid frame that finds it very difficult to see other parts of the world in a future sense and a tense, relegating certain developing markets to certain parts of the supply chain, sort of having this sort of paternal view of how to incorporate emerging markets and developing countries into the multilateral development system, and using that as a base to then try to figure out how to have some level playing field, which doesn't exist. So, from the investment side, we feel that the multilateral system has completely missed the opportunity to frame the entire agenda as one of an investment agenda. It's immediately retarded its opportunity to be successful by calling everything a green finance agenda, and then putting us all at the behest of development finance institutions with a $1.5 trillion balance sheet to solve a 35 to 100 trillion problem, or 25 trillion in emerging markets, 3 trillion in Africa if you just focus on the nationally determined contributions. And it seems to have a big problem engaging with the 300 trillion pool of global institutional capital that is looking for growth, that can take these long-term views. There's no way that you can fund a $50 to $100 trillion transition, which is multi-decade, on a concessional finance credit card. But yet, I think the multilateral system is continuing to muddle around, confusing governments that it can actually do this, when we all want to see how rather we can make these opportunities trade-related, more industrial in their base and orientation. But this conversation, we saw what happened at Baku. We understand that the Baku 300 billion from the 100 muddle billion per annum is essentially a 12% increase if you adjust for inflation. So, and that's all on the basis that we all understand that there's we need the trillions. So I think that the multilateral system really needs to be unlocked to enfranchise a very different level of participation for the global institutional pools of capital. And until such time that can happen, we're just going to be going around in circles, because we'll be moving commas around a paragraph as opposed to getting these things done. So I think that we need to take much more of a multipolar view. There needs to be more of a coalition of catalysts, those of us who are serious, that want to bring pools of capital together to solve problems. And when we talk about multipolarism, we're talking about how can Europe work with Africa to satisfy our own sort of development needs, our financing needs, as a stage one. But then a stage two would be, how can we then collaborate on green technologies to access and service the $10 trillion per annum and growing global green industrial economy, not put up CBAMs every 5 minutes when competition starts getting a bit hairy. So I really think that we need to sort of understand that the game is up in terms of the old broken model. If we are genuine about trying to solve for this issue, it needs the pools of capital that can actually solve for the problem. And we need to find a risk-adjusted way, a nature and climate risk-adjusted fashion against which we can actually meet these, in green industrial opportunities for the benefit of people, planet, and nature. So I'm glad to have been here, and I'm glad to have listened to all these conversations. But the ability to get to that scale the ability for that scale to be deployed through in a way that is a reimagined acceleration of the geopolitical decision-making process. And until such time, there won't be any solutions that we'll be able to break through until we can actually reimagine how to accelerate the geopolitical decision-making process on prioritized issues like this. So let me just use that as my little perspective, and I'm really interested to hear any views and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, in some ways, I think our conversation today is really about how to unlock this new view of investment, where you need some success stories and some actors who are prepared to drive things. Because I think the multilateral system, I think, is not likely to reform itself in such a way that it can do this, but there needs to be out-of-the-box actors who are prepared to push this. Michael Zamet-Kuziar, we heard you were waving your hand discreetly, and we'd like to hear from you now.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Because I'm not very clued up on Zoom. And I only stumbled into the fact that there was this meeting this morning, so I haven't really prepared for it. My name is Michael Zamet-Kuziar. I was the first executive secretary of the Climate Change Secretariat, therefore had the pleasure of working with quite a few of you. In fact, I was launched, parachuted into this thing almost 34 years to the day, 1991 February, if I'm not mistaken. Richard, you were there, I suppose. Anyway, just a few thoughts looking back over these 34 years. The first positive thing, I think, is that there's no real denial that there is a problem. There may be some people, including a guy who is going to be given a new job today, who is saying this is nonsense. But on the whole, there's no longer a debate that there is an issue that human activity is changing the climate. That's a positive, I think. I remember discussions at the very beginning saying, no, it's sunspots, it's this or that or the other. We do have a target, a generally accepted target. Joanna has reminded us that it's 2, if possible 1.5. We get a bit fixed on 1.5, but don't forget that 2 is really the target. And the question is how to get to that target. And I guess that I too, like others who have spoken, are not, I'm not convinced that making legally binding agreements is going to get things done, because people can thumb their nose at those. It's rather it's the realization that this climate change has a negative impact on us now and on future generations in terms of well-being, economic well-being in particular. Initially, this was seen mainly in terms of adaptation by developing countries, but increasingly it is seen as a problem that affects all of us. These wildfires in California, I read, have been made worse by the impact of climate change. So do we recognize sufficiently strongly that is something on which action is necessary? I very much agree with those who say that there is a tremendous increase in the realization of the economic opportunity of doing something and the lowering of the cost of doing that thing. Renewables, I think Nicholas mentioned. So we aren't sort of pushing up against a blank wall, but saying, how can we get to do these things which actually make economic sense? On that, I have a little side thought that troubles me. We're telling the established industrialized countries, move away from using fossil fuels and get into the new economic opportunity of renewables. What do you tell Mozambique or Namibia, who've only just discovered that they have oil and it's their main source of development? Do we tell them to stop as well? That's a little question. I don't have an answer to it. But on the whole, I do think that there's a tremendous shift towards looking at the economic advantage of doing the right thing. And my last point, which is an old point, and others have mentioned it, is the importance of reliable accountability, credible accountability. I don't know how we sort of set this up, but the biggest risk possibly these days is greenwash. You can't go to the supermarket and buy something without it being covered with labels saying it's climate friendly. How on earth do I know that it's climate friendly? But that's the micro level. But at the general, at the country level too, a system of credible accountability is, I think, the key. And that needs to be multilaterally set up and multilaterally recognized. I think I leave it at that, Richard.
Great, thank you, Michael. You're reminding me about the first climate meeting in Chantilly, Virginia. It was also at the time of a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, and I remember his speaker at the meeting announced that it was not to be concerned about the greenhouse effect because you should watch out for the White House effect. We've come a long way in those 30 years, and many of you today have talked about the positive developments, but I think we're going to see a not so great White House effect for the next little while. Next, I think, was Jen Allen again. Yeah.
Whoops, sorry. I'll be very quick. I think what a lot of our conversation is about is what can the climate process, the UNFCCC, catalyze in other areas, like in investment, especially. And what is the role of the UN climate negotiations, or do we mainstream climate across other processes and other negotiations? And I think that really is one of the sticking blocks, is that there's other areas where we need global cooperation, but I'm not convinced that the UNFCCC is the best place for that. When we were negotiating bread, they weren't forest people in that room, and it took ages. So maybe we should get the investment people talking about climate investment. And I think just to Michael's quick question on the breakthrough agenda, I really liked this idea, and it's the same, Simon's not here, because it was sectoral, and I've been, for my sins, foolishly going through all sorts of side events and pavilion events and of these big giant COPs. And off the top of my head, the only one that I can see that continues to gather or host anything in the last couple COPs has been the Cement Breakthrough Agenda Coalition. And the main problem with any presidency initiative, is that they're specific to that presidency. Ministers move on, the bureaucrats leading it maybe move on, although Simon's still kicking, where you lose the people who are involved without that accountability mechanism. And there isn't necessarily always an institutional mechanism. What was it? Chile started a finance ministers coalition, and it's now institutionalized in the World Bank. So they do meet a couple times a year. But I mean, it's just institutional diversity, how these things work or how they don't. But the problem is when there's no follow-up, there's no reporting back. I don't know if anyone's heard from the Global Methane Pledge lately. So yeah, I'm very skeptical of these presidency initiatives, to be honest, even the ones that are really good ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I mean, I really think that many of these initiatives had tremendous potential, and perhaps it was a mistake to rely on the presidency so much. There needs to be leading countries who are prepared to play the role of convener and leader and that type of thing to get to deliver the promise of what some of these are. In particular, I mean, the methane one is a really good example where there's tremendous potential. We're coming to the end of our time. I have only one hand. There might be time for a couple of other people if you wanted to make short comments. But Sebastian, you're up next.
Yeah, and it was actually on the same theme since Michael asked, because it's really the story of how we create more accountability and a system where that can happen. And it has to do with the initiatives and the breakthrough agenda itself. It also has to do with how the processes around that at the COP or beyond that perhaps are structured so that actually there's really a spotlight on these in terms of attention, because they're doing good things also in the review of the breakthrough. Every year there's a good report, but who actually reads about it and really puts it into the limelight? So I think that's some thinking to be done there. Will perhaps not save the world, but perhaps be a step forward.
Thank you, Sebastian. I guess I was also reminded by Jen's comment, which we haven't really raised so much, but I tend to get into a very worked up state when I think about other UN processes that are not doing what they should be doing, in particular ICAO, IMO, and FAO, which seem to be the main institutional actors for sectors where real progress would be possible if they would actually decide they want to act for climate instead of for the vested interests that participate in these processes. Although I was reading today something which indicates there may be some progress in IMO in the short term. But I think that would be something that we also need to be clear about, that yes, UNFCCC is a catalyst and can help, but it's not the center of the universe. And this is an all of government, all of multilateralism issue where everybody needs to pull their weight. And there's still a lot to do. The dilemma we will face, I think, in the current world is, with the United States having been such an important actor in the last 4 years and in previous rounds, how momentum can be reestablished. To what extent will others like the EU and China be willing to, and the BRICS, I guess the BRICS were mentioned earlier, how will these be willing to move forward in the absence of US engagement? One can only hope that they would find ways to find common interests, responding to Sir Michael's point about our overall common interest, that would really move the action agenda forward, and then the whole idea of economic norms would also move. But that breakthrough, the breakthrough that was being mentioned, remains sort of the critical point of focus. Well, I see we're now at the end. Dr. Danso, did you have a closing comment?
Yes, sorry, just a very brief one. It was really much more of a question to everyone, because we're in this year in terms of the road to Belém and the 1.3 trillion that's required, and hopefully, we're going to arrive in Brazil at least with some form of document. But I'd be interested to get everyone's views about at which point are we going to really understand that the multilateral system itself will not be able to mobilize finance in the absence of actually finding a way not just to mobilize institutional investment, but rather being able to institutionalize investment to be able to deliver the goal. Because we actually seem to be deferring all of the capacity to be able to mobilize private finance to multilateral development banks who have a woeful record of mobilizing $10 for every $1 of MDB finance that they provide. We all know that the G20 has found out that they only mobilize 20 to 38 cents. And if you come out with the Baku agreement showed that the MDBs are now responsible for mobilizing the private sector proponent of the 300 billion. So we're actually using as the catalyst institution to mobilize critical finance at scale, at a speed that is unprecedented, the same institutions that have been failing abysmally at mobilizing private capital with a $1.5 trillion balance sheet. And then when they're not engaging the institutions that have a 300 trillion pool of capital just for historic philosophical reasons and competitive reasons. And all of these conversations will center back to the lack of finance, or the lack of availability of finance. So we always say that the institutional investment community, who have long-term mandates, can actually take a much more strategic patient capital view that really does take account of all of these sort of different developmental and nature-based and biodiversity-related issues. But there just seems to be this block that, or this mindset that believes that private finance and private capital mobilization needs to be intermediated through the most unproductive, failed private capital mobilizers. And until that happens, we're gonna, the trillion gaps are going to grow. The time to actually close the gap is going to increase. So I worry that I think this one specific move about how to engage that 300 trillion pool of capital as a seat around the table, UNFCCC have no mechanism for us to be able to engage. So I don't know where these trillions are coming from outside of the multilateral development balance sheet, when there is not even a formal recognition of a seat around the table for the 300 trillion pool of institutional capital that's committed and interested in being part of the solution. So I just hope that as we go forward, at least even if we put aside the global financial architecture conversation, I always say that our ability to be able to extrapolate the private capital mobilization dynamic of the global financial architecture conversation is really going to be, if you want to mobilize public capital at scale, don't ask the private sector to be able to help you, because it's best served by those who really understand that system. But similarly, we now have a situation where the private sector and institutional investment community are best placed to be able to co-lead on the mobilization of private capital. But that realization has not hit our political leaders, who are the plenipotentiary shareholders and leaders of the MDBs, who still put the MDBs in charge of private capital mobilization, when we all know and understand they compete with private capital and they have never been able to deliver private capital mobilization at scale. So I would just hope that in our conversations, as we try to find solutions, we do really begin to think about how to unlock that 300 trillion pool on market-aligned terms. Thank you.
No, I think that unlocking argument is particularly important, and one can only be discouraged by the recent news of the significant banks pulling out of these various sustainability investment initiatives at a time when one would have hoped for something else. Anyway, I said we would finish in 90 minutes. I'm a bit 1 minute over, so I apologize for that. As promised, we will try to turn this into some sort of paper, which you'll all have a chance to look at. And then I would be delighted if you would, if you had comments and wanted to embellish, and we could continue the dialogue a bit in that way, in hopes that we could help to drive forward this conversation about how we could have multilateralism contribute more effectively to promoting action. With that, I would invite you to the next FOG's Open Consultation, which, as you see on your screen, will be on 10 February, and it will be on the very intriguing concept of decolonizing the United Nations. So with that, I wish everyone a good evening. I think I personally am not going to read the news, at least until tomorrow. I don't think I can face all of the horribleness that will come out over the next few hours, but everyone else, be strong, and let's keep working together for a better climate future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Richard.